Hey everyone, just want to take a brief amount of time to talk about some eccentric training concepts and why that's beneficial to you as a basketball player. For those that don't know what eccentric training is or eccentric muscular contraction, there's essentially three types of muscle contractions that we can have: eccentric, isometric, concentric. Let's think about the quad muscles during a squat. So as we're going down with a squat, that is the eccentric part of the squat. It's the controlled lowering or the controlled lengthening of the quadricep muscle. So think about as you go down, that muscle is firing. Obviously it's firing because we're not free falling down towards the ground, but as it's firing, it is lengthening as we go down. Isometric is there's muscle firing, but there's no muscle movement. So think about holding the bottom portion of a squat. Obviously the muscle is firing, because if it wasn't firing, you would just drop down towards the ground, but we're not going up or down from that position. We're just holding that bottom position. And then the concentric part of the squat, or that coming back up to the standing position, the muscle is firing and it's shortening. So those are the three types of muscle contractions, and we're really focusing on the eccentric portion, or that controlled lowering, that controlled lengthening aspect. Now, why is that so important? First and foremost, eccentric training is a really good way to increase your muscle mass and your strength. And as a basketball player, you need both of those to be successful. Especially we look at the physicality of basketball players today. It definitely would benefit you to build a little bit of muscle and build strength as well. Not only for the physicality of the game today, but the stronger you are and the more muscle mass that you have, you're going to increase your capacity for power. So simply put, the stronger you get, the greater capability your body has to run faster and jump higher. So that is really why focusing on some eccentric training is a really good benefit as a basketball player. Now obviously when we're talking about this, increasing your muscle mass, increasing your strength, we're not going for bodybuilder physique. If we got to that point, obviously there's going to be limitations in our mobility on the court and our range of motion. But if you're throwing in your strength training, your weight room work, and still working on your skill work on the court, working on your cardio and your conditioning, chances are your body just will not be able to build that much muscle. It's going to build enough muscle that you need to perform on the court. Now, in terms of good techniques to use, for this first concept, this increasing our muscle mass, increasing our strength, there's a couple different ways that we can do it. Number one is to just really emphasize that eccentric movement when we're doing weight room work with tempo exercises. So if we go back to a squat, instead of just going up and down fast with a squat, which I think a lot of people in the weight room nowadays kind of focus on, trying to take advantage of a stretch reflex to get back up quick, increase the tempo, or increase the amount of time that it takes you to go down. So in a squat, really make sure that you're going 3 to 4 seconds controlled down before you explode back up. If you're doing any type of chest press or overhead pressing for the upper body, really focus on 3 to 4 seconds controlling down before you explode up. So that is one concept to really emphasize in eccentric training. Another really good technique, especially for the lower body, is a 1 down, 2 up method. So if you think of a single leg box squat, controlling yourself down to a box or a bench with one leg. We want to think about controlling down with one leg, so a good 3 to 4 seconds going down towards that box or that bench, and then using 2 feet to bring yourself back up. Now, what we can really take advantage of with this method is finding a weight that our body can control down with one leg, but does not have the ability to stand that up with one leg. So let's say, just for the sake of numbers, you're holding a 50-pound dumbbell. You can control that weight down to a box or bench with one leg, and you can still stand up with that 50 pounds. You'll want to go heavier. So then let's say we hold a 60-pound dumbbell. You hold that 60-pound dumbbell, you control yourself down to that box or bench 3 to 4 seconds with one leg, and you can't stand back up with that one leg. So you need 2 legs to get back up to that standing position. So that is a really good way to overload our eccentric muscular contraction, because our eccentric muscular contraction is our stronger muscular contraction. We're going to be able to lower and control more weight down, and we're going to be able to concentrically bring it back up to a start position. So a 1 down, 2 up method, especially for the lower body, really good way to build that strength in the lower body. Going down to concept number 2 here. Now this is a really important one that I think it's overlooked a lot. Number one is, obvious, just the more muscle mass, the more strength you have, the better you're going to be on the court, because you're going to have an increased capacity to run faster, jump higher. Number 2 goes a little bit more into the sciencey part of it. So if we look at number 2, eccentric training is a good way to decrease what's called the Golgi tendon organ reflex. Now, if you look at your muscular system and your skeletal system, obviously muscle is attached to the bone. Now, if we looked at, just for the sake of, this video, if we looked at my bicep. So with my bicep, I have the muscle belly, and then what attaches that muscle to the bones is tendons. So what the Golgi tendon organ reflex is you essentially have these receptors up on your tendon. So let's say with my bicep, my tendon is way up here around the shoulder area. I have, receptors on that tendon. Now, what often happens is that is essentially a defensive mechanism that the body has to prevent injury, that Golgi tendon organ reflex. Because what essentially happens, let's say my bicep rapidly extends, it gets pulled. And if we look at that pulling motion, that bicep is lengthening. So we can view that kind of as an eccentric movement of the bicep. What the Golgi tendon organ does is when that muscle is rapidly elongated, those receptors sense that velocity and that contraction and essentially send signals to turn my bicep off. Now that's a defense mechanism because my brain is essentially saying, okay, that bicep is rapidly extending. I'm going to turn the muscle off. I'm going to prevent it from contracting because the brain doesn't want that muscle to violently contract and then essentially tear itself or tear the tendon off the bone. So the Golgi tendon organ reflex receptors on the tendons, it senses rapid elongation of the muscle and tries to turn that muscle off. Now, if we think about something like a two-legged jump, you can see how if that system kicked in, that's not really going to be beneficial towards us. So think about going to plant, you're trying to take off for a 2-footed dunk. As you go down into that 2-footed dunk, especially, or that 2-foot plant for that 2-foot dunk, instead of your quads and glutes then contracting to propel you in the air, those muscles essentially just shut off and you collapse down towards the ground. Obviously a little bit of exaggeration, but that's a similar concept. What we want to take advantage of instead is a different type of reflex that the body has, which is the muscle spindle reflex. So back to the bicep. So again, I have those Golgi tendon organ receptors on the tendon. On the muscle belly that we mentioned before, there are also receptors, and those are essentially the muscle spindle reflex. Now those work opposite of the Golgi tendon organ reflex. Same overall goal, where it's essentially a defense mechanism that the body has, but it works in different ways. Where the Golgi tendon organ reflex wants to shut off the muscle so it can continue to elongate without resistance to prevent being torn. What the muscle spindle reflex does is it senses that rapid elongation and then it actually tries to shorten that muscle back into a stronger position. So we think about that muscle spindle, it's not trying to let the arm elongate, it's trying to contract that muscle back to that contracted position. So we could think about that would be beneficial on the basketball court if we're trying to go up into, say, a 2-foot dunk. So I go into that 2-foot plant, and instead of the Golgi tendon organ reflex kicking in, the muscle spindle reflex kicks in, and instead of those quad muscles and glute muscles essentially turning off and continuing to elongate, allowing me to essentially drop down towards the floor, they aggressively contract and propel myself up into the air. And eccentric training is one method that we can utilize to essentially turn the body from relying on this Golgi tendon organ reflex and going more towards that muscle spindle reflex. So again, we shut off the body's mechanism where it's essentially trying to just let the muscle go limp and continue to elongate, and try to shift that emphasis more towards the muscle spindle reflex, taking advantage of a reflex that tries to aggressively contract that muscle. So eccentric training, like I said, really good way to kind of shift from that one mechanism to another mechanism. And that, like we already talked about, that decreases that tendency to essentially collapse, especially if you're a younger basketball player, or if you're someone who maybe a little bit, older in age, haven't really played basketball, but you're trying to do something athletic, and basketball was something you decided to do. Chances are that your body might shift more towards this Golgi tendon organ reflex versus the muscle spindle reflex. So eccentric training, a really good way to shift towards a more helpful utilization that our body can use on the court. And number 3, so there's a lot of talk. I've heard a lot of people say that, eccentric training is really good for injury prevention. I put a question mark here because it's really, the answer to that is yes and no. Yes, because basically the stronger we get and the more that our body can tolerate in a controlled manner, in that controlled lengthening, so we're gonna think about that squat, the more our body can control down, the heavier weight our body can control down, in theory, the stronger we're gonna become, the stronger we become, the less prone we are to injury. But if we think about injuries on basketball court, it rarely ever happens in a slow movement. So you're never really going through a movement on a basketball court like 3 to 4 seconds down. You're not going 3 to 4 seconds down into your jump prep and lowering before you jump up, towards the rim or towards the ball. So we want to think about, if we're talking about injury prevention, yes, eccentric training is going to help, but we also want to throw in more, rapid eccentric training or rapid force absorption. So a combination of those tempo movements, those 1 down, 2 up movements, while also focusing on some quick deceleration. So thinking about single leg pull downs, altitude drops off of a box. Essentially, to work laterally, a single leg lateral skater with a stick. Just trying to expose the body to, it's still eccentric muscular contraction, eccentric movement, but it's happening at a speed that is going to more simulate what we're going to see on the basketball court. So for injury prevention purposes, you really need both. You need that slower, heavier eccentric training and that quicker force absorption, rapid deceleration to simulate the forces that you're going to see on the court. So that'll wrap up the video today. Again, just wanted to talk a little bit about eccentric training. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot in terms of training in the weight room. I think the more knowledge you can have going in, the better you can plan and prepare your workouts, and the better, more efficient time you're going to spend, and the more time that you have to spend on the court to become a better basketball player. So if you guys liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you on the next one.